10 seconds, 2 seconds? Whatever Jihye is ready.
I have something to pass around. I would have more copies, but this is the only copy I've got. So if you guys want to take a look at it, they're out, it's okay. I've got excerpts up here too, but if you guys wanted to have the actual book in your hands, I'll be passing around a copy of V for Vendetta.
Well, what's this? Comic books? I mean,
you know what? I've got Statler and Waldorf all in one in that seat, you know? Thank you so much.
You knew you were going to get technology there.
Oh, have we started?
Yeah.
All right, here we go.
Here we go. Yeah. Hi, I'm Jihye Shin. I'm from Valencia College, the James M. and Dale L. Seneff Honors College, and I'm presenting something on comic books. Ink and spandex was my specific subject. I thought that comic books would kind of be a strange subject to present since they're not exactly the most academic of subjects. And funny enough, I'm in the interdisciplinary studies track, and we incorporate a lot of different texts into studies of modern history and culture as well as ancient history and culture. And throughout, there's always been a very visual component. Anywhere that humans go, we draw some form of picture that correlates as to how we feel and how we think. So comic books are actually a very excellent way of, in a sense, litmus testing how we as a culture see things. So here we go. I said that the history of modern comic books is the history of populist America, and I chose the word populist specifically because it refers to pop culture. Most people consider populist things to be rather disposable, I think, and that's kind of a sad thing because once upon a time Charles Dickens was a populist author, and yet now he's vindicated by time, by critics. Nabokov once said that in Dickens there is everything, and he was a guy who was paid by the word in a column, you know? So once upon a time people were going, oh, Dickens is very common, I'm sure, but now he's someone that is venerated by academics. Comic books don't necessarily have that same welcoming air, which I hope to change.
we like that.
That's the first Superman. What happened?
These are probably two of the most well-known comic book covers. The one on the left, naturally, is The Birth of Superman in 1938. Action Comics #1, DC. And this is the golden age of comics, truly, because it's the birth of the modern comic book industry. It said that comic books started out when a guy had free comic books from the gas station, stuck on 10-cent stickers. By the weekend, they were sold, and an industry was born. I don't know if that's true, but it's a really nice story, because it illustrates, again, this element of entertainment that people view comics as. Literally, cheap entertainment. It was 10 cents for kids. And here, the birth of Batman. Superman, Batman, these are both iconic heroes, and yet the imagery here, it's violent, the colors are crazy, and that's not just because the background is yellow. It's the nuts in here, the lines are crude, and we're looking at this and going, this isn't a sophisticated way of storytelling at all. It's not impressive. Moving on to the current age, which is the modern age of comic books, this is a splash from Sin City. Frank Miller, anybody? And the bottom is, of course, a splash page from Watchmen by Alan Moore. And these two were both published in 1986, and this is what we call the modern age of comic books because this was a time when comic books suddenly had a different air. They had bigger, grander narratives, more complex stories, bigger, harder themes than what was previously discussed. Before, comic books were crippled more or less by the Comics Code Authority, where you were not allowed to write stories that were not somehow family-oriented. So of course you had adventures with Superman and the Beatles saving the world from littering or something. Very Captain Planet, not exactly the most hard-hitting of story media. And in 1986, we have this. The book that I'm passing out to you, V for Vendetta, was published in 1982, and I have to note this because it's 4 years ahead of the modern age of comic books. Funny enough, 1982, it's a herald for what comes afterward, really, because V for Vendetta is a graphic novel that talks about difficult adult themes that weren't exactly seen before in British comics and American comics. V for Vendetta is naturally a graphic novel. It's one single book that I'm passing out. It's not different issues. It's not. It was published in issues, but like Sherlock Holmes' A Study in Scarlet, it was published in chapters, and yet we read it as one story. Commonly, when comic books are serialized in graphic novels that way, we tend to see them as one overarching work. So this is a spread from Batman: Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, 1989. Also a very good year for comics. This doesn't look normal to you, does it? Because it looks, pretty weird to me. The art of it is nightmarish, and it was a really difficult work for people to look at when they first saw this book come out. This was published in America by DC Comics, but it was written by Grant Morrison, illustrated by Dave McKeon. the comic book that I'm passing out here, illustrated by Lloyd and Alan Moore, these are 4 guys who are not American. And this is what we nerds like to call the comics British invasion. Like the Beatles, like the Rolling Stones. This is a time when American comics culture was becoming very stale and very soft. And suddenly there were these people from across the pond who were telling these amazingly complex and crazy stories. And their preferred method of storytelling was indeed the graphic novel. This is Alan Moore. This is young Alan Moore, and this is middle-aged Alan Moore. I tried to find a picture of old Alan Moore, and he was terrifying. So, Alan Moore was not exactly a guy that could do well in I don't know what he would have done if comic books had not existed. We'll put it this way. He was not exactly the most driven student. He wasn't an honor student, I'm sure of it. He began selling drugs when he was 15 years old, and he called himself, he admitted that he was the world's most inept LSD seller. He was not good at anything, really, but the funny thing is he could draw and he could tell stories. So Alan Moore here now is a rock star in comic books, but by the time he started out, people were going, what are you doing with your life? Again, comic books, when he started doing this, people were going, that's not a real career. That's just light, cheap, stupid stuff. You gotta get a real job. Well, Alan Moore makes a lot of money now, guys, and if I could do his job, I'd rather do his, okay? Alan Moore's career is huge. He has more or less spearheaded the British comics invasion. These are just a selection of works that he's done since arriving in the United States. 1986, Watchmen. But it's also that he began to pioneer a way of DC Comics especially having this relationship with Great Britain, bringing in these young, talented, more or less underground chic storytellers and artists to bring home a taste of something fresh, something interesting. It's like watching a really, really light Saturday morning cartoon and then suddenly realizing that there is more to a specific medium than light, cheap entertainment. Comic books after 1986 were not exactly seen as stupid little books with pictures that had no themes. And Alan Moore is largely responsible for this attitude in his time. Here is The Killing Joke. Here is him again, and he did have more or less an exclusive relationship with DC until it got a bit messy economically. Alan Moore is a guy who is very much in touch with his political side. He aligns more on the lines of anarchy than you have to tell me what to do all the time. So he went to DC and he said, you know what, this has been really nice, but you're bullying me. I'm going to get out of town. V for Vendetta is probably it's his first modern graphic novel. And it's kind of a big deal now because, for example, the IDH track in the Son of Honors College, they're using it as a common read. V for Vendetta is a work that Alan Moore was incredibly tied to personally. It was a time when Margaret Thatcher was in power in Great Britain. And I think the papers used to say that she could steal milk out of children's mouths. She was not exactly the most benevolent prime minister that Great Britain had, especially when, through the eyes of Alan Moore, who saw her as a very hardcore, conservative human being. So there were already tensions, but V for Vendetta is a work that takes that to the next extreme. Comic books have always been a way for us to discover new fantasies through very human means. And V for Vendetta is the exact same way. It's artistically revolutionary. If you remember the action comics and the detective comics of late 1930s, they were crude, they were primitive, the colors were nuts. Whereas this, it's much more subtle. The colors are subdued, and here they even innovate something very interesting. These are fireworks. And Dave Lloyd and Alan Moore said to each other, we will not be illustrating sound effects. We are going to let the reader see for themselves and draw those conclusions because they're smart people. There are smart people who read comic books, and it's time to show them that. It's also a graphic novel that absolutely deserves that title. A novel, in many senses, it's not just a very long book. It's a book that discusses complex themes. It's one single narrative that's more like a rich tapestry than anything else. And V for Vendetta absolutely fits that mold. It is a story about fascism, true. It's a story about political philosophy. Here, V is actually talking to a statue of Lady Justice and accusing her of betting another ideal, I suppose, which would be fascism. He is saying here, or rather accusing Lady Justice of cheating on what she should have been. She should have been true. She should have been fair to everybody. And instead, she said, no, actually, this fascism idea kind of seems okay because on the outside, we're going to make it seem like it will be fair. It's very Harrison Bergeron. But on the underlying form, everyone is going to be the same no matter what, and it will be cruel and cold. Lady Justice, V feels, has lied to him. Therefore, he has met his own mistress, Lady Anarchy. And this little heart box here is a gift from him as a parting gift, and he blows up the statue of Lady Justice. If that's not some kind of visual metaphor for a repressed anger of government, I don't know what is. So it's a book that also, it's a graphic novel that discusses political themes, but it's also an incredibly personal novel. If you're reading Anna Karenina, it's certainly a difficult book, and yet it also revolves around the personal narrative of one person. V for Vendetta is very much the same way. While you're going through the graphic novel, you start to discover what kind of person V is, and more importantly, why he is the way he is. And this is something that makes classic novels throughout the ages resonate with us. I think that's it.
Questions, please.
Questions? Stephanie, yeah.
Okay,
Here we go.
so regarding the themes, there are a lot of books that have the same themes now, but you're saying that that particular book, at the time it came out, that was the first time those themes were incorporated into a comic book, and how did that impact the real life of, I mean, exactly,
Yeah,
how did that impact the real life of the readers and the current
I think superhero comics, especially because they conform to a certain ideal and archetype, they stand for something. They stand for different things, but they stand for at least one thing. And the thing with V is that it fits a traditional mold in the sense of incorporating the theme of politics in comics. That's very true. Since the beginning of the comic book industry, Superman and Batman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, Spider-Man, they've always been going around addressing social issues and political issues. But I think V for Vendetta is one work that not only discusses a very harsh political theme. Fascism isn't, something very lightly talked about, but it's also the idea of incorporating it in a way that was gritty, that was realistic, and it had an incredibly compelling aura to it. After I finished reading V for Vendetta, I think I could understand why people thought that anarchy was such an interesting political ideal. And that's rare, I think, in comic books. I think that's the biggest theme of them all. It's the idea that a comic book was empowering to people in a higher level than simple entertainment. Yes?
Just a comment. Thank you for giving me information to help stop people from demoralizing comics. Even though I don't like you.
Wow.
I just wow. Oh, wow. Wow, talk about a fastball. Well, it's certainly true. I'm hoping that more and more people understand that comic books are not simple things. Mouse and Art Spiegelman's magnum opus won the 1992 Pulitzer Prize, for example. And the Pulitzer Prize is absolutely a very large award recognized in any circle. So there's that, too. So comic books are fun these days. In the back. I saw his hand. Stetson. I saw your hand.
How do you feel about V for Vendetta's, do you feel it's influenced the current socio-political climate in regards to
You're talking about Anonymous.
protests and the like that was going forward? Or do you think it's just sort of that one symbol has been adapted
Well,
in terms of the
I think in terms of the one symbol, in that sense, I think it's successful in both ways. The one symbol that V for Vendetta, that people take away after reading it, is the mask, right? The Guy Fawkes mask. And in America, it stands for many, many different factions, but usually some form of, you can't tell me what to do, I'm going to do what I want to do, usually. I point to the example of Occupy Wall Street using the masks. But it's also the idea, I think, that we tend to forget that V for Vendetta is a comic book about a superhero. And a superhero in the sense of someone who fights for an ideal, that him against the world, and he uses an icon to fight that war too. Batman has that bat symbol. He doesn't have to be there, but if that is, then he is. If V for Vendetta, in V for Vendetta, if V didn't have the mask, then he loses a part of that superhero archetype. So in a sense, that one icon, while it's just one icon, I think is an incredibly important component of the graphic novel. That being said, I'm pretty sure that the graphic novel too was incredibly influential because not only has it influenced outside means like socio-political activities, it's also influenced the industry hugely. Comic books were not the same after V for Vendetta came out.
A couple more questions, guys?
Yes. Yes, Mia.
I want to thank you for definitely enlightening over the ideas of comic books. I really am seeing that comic book as a common read really influences me.
For an honors college, I know, it's crazy.
Well, no, it influences me as a faculty member to really look deeply into comics. Thank you.
Valencia College has a copy of Mouse, the Pulitzer Prize winning comic book, in all 4 campuses, and it's been used in classroom materials before, and in non-honors classes. So it's interesting to see different generations look back at this now. Hey, let this in
Diving a little bit into Mouse itself, you obviously did a lecture on, but I was just wondering if you think that graphic novels such as Mouse is easier to portray things such as World War II to a younger generation.
I don't know about that because I think that honestly depends on the merit of the creator more than anything else. Certainly now in the modern industry, graphic novels tend to be the favored medium of certain comics creators. That's true, especially after the popularity of the comic graphic novel. But I think issue by issue is also good too, because an event like World War II, I don't know if something that big can be encapsulated in one graphic novel. Sometimes the serialized issues themselves can still teach us a lesson, and they take us through that on a very personal basis. It's more intimate, I think, than a formal graphic novel. So I think that also depends on the strength of the creator.
I was going to say that we used a Watchmen in that class.
Yes, you did. You did use Watchmen, and I thought that was so cool. I was so excited. Yes, Dr. Dickens.
Question.
Yes.
See, I don't know on what level you're taking this. For example, years ago as a teenager, I was in Louisville, Kentucky, and Muhammad Ali was on the sidewalk, and they asked him about the fight with Doug Jones, and he said, in Freedom Hall is where he will fall because I will hit him in the jaw. And the people, oh, that is great. Now, I compare that with the poetry of Robert Frost.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Now, if we take the comic books, can we compare it with the literature of Hawthorne?
Specifically Hawthorne?
Well, Steinbeck. Go with Steinbeck.
Okay,
No, I don't know on what level we're talking
Steinbeck,
about.
I think, because for me, largely, I'm more familiar with Nathaniel Hawthorne's fiction work. I don't know if he's ever written nonfiction, but I know that John Steinbeck wrote both nonfiction and fiction, so I'll take him as the example. I think.
Okay.
Comic books, I think, if anything, they're just a medium. Storytelling, like the written word, like visual art, like just painting, sculpture. So in a fashion, I think that they tell a story in a way that's more accessible because they started out as a popular culture novelty item. I think the Steinbeck comparison honestly has to wait because the thing with most classic works is that they've been vindicated by time, and the graphic novel was born in 1972, so it's a very young work, if anything. So, but going back within comic books, I think the graphic novel specifically will be regarded that way. But outside of the industry, comic books have never been able to shake off that stigma of simple, cheap entertainment.
Yes.
But
That's what I'm asking.
But I think in academic circles, the more we use such items like V for Vendetta to discuss serious themes, I think that will change. I hope so.
We have time for, I think, one more question.
And in the back.
Would you say that graphic novels, just like other fiction work that preceded them, affect social change by opening a dialogue into what we expect society to be based on an ideal?
Well, that goes into many different directions right there already. Wow. I think in a sense that one ideal that comic books, specifically superhero comic books, portray is that there is a good and an evil. I think that's the one thing that a lot of people tend to remember. Superheroes are heroes because they fight the bad guys. But in terms of reinforcing an ideal, I think especially in the idea of women in comic books, the portrayal of the female body in comic books. That's always been a rather taboo subject, I think, especially with the rise of the Comics Code Authority, where you couldn't portray the female figure at all. So women just have heads, I guess. But now, I think, because there are more women within the industry, that changes. Gail Simone, who's a rather prolific writer of comic books herself, there are many different female artists coming in now, and they're not just underground. These are mainstream women in charge of the image that they create. So comic books, while they've largely always been a reflection of the internal ideas that these creators have had, on the whole, I think a lot of people are beginning to expect a stronger, more empowering image from comic books, specifically because they enable the fantasy that we all want. Superheroes, more than anything else, are that power fantasy. Everybody wants to be Wonder Woman. Everybody wants to be Superman, because these are people who stand above their problems, fight them, and come out on top. So I think that's a very human element.
Okay.